I have not stepped out of China for nearly half a decade. I've been here for the entire COVID-0 experience, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about that, plus my thoughts on the protests, the reforms, and how media has been covering the whole thing. What's up, guys? I'm coming at you from Chongqing, where we just came out of a 3-week lockdown. It was kind of a soft lockdown compared to previous lockdowns in other parts of the country. You could come out of your apartment and your homes as long as you stayed within your living community, your estate. And once every 2 days, you could apply to leave. One person from your family could apply to leave your estate. But if you asked nicely at the front gate, at least where we were, they would still let you out. They wouldn't make a big deal about it. And even if you didn't want to ask nicely, I remember one of my neighbors who went and said, 你们是来服务我们，不是管理我们, which basically means you are here to serve us, not to control us, not to manage us. And he's right, it's our management fees that are paying their salary. Whatever the case may be, it was quite a bit more loose than before. And this was before the protests. And even before then, one of my friends was in a building that had a confirmed case. Usually what would happen is the entire estate would be locked down for at least 14 days. In his case, only his single building was locked down. And after 3 days, they were reopened after staff came through and had a daily tested everybody in the building until they were sure that nobody else had COVID, and they reopened. So it was already quite a bit more loose before the protests. Now, before I get to the protests, I want to talk about what it was like to live under COVID-0. After the initial lockdowns in Wuhan, life was, I wouldn't want to say normal, but it was a new kind of normal that people could accept. Small pockets of people were regularly inconvenienced, but on a larger scale, people could travel around China without having to worry about getting COVID. And for many, it was a trade-off that was worth it. It had public support, and people were kind of happy about being in the safest place on earth in terms of COVID for quite a while there. But as you can imagine, things drew on, and the idea of the virus became more and more distant, but the idea of getting caught up in a lockdown got more and more close. As schools were closing especially regularly and kids had to go to online learning, the stress levels increased. I would say the real catalyst was the Shanghai lockdowns. When the big lockdowns happened there, and people were sent off to COVID facilities and things like that, that's when people started to ask, is this really sustainable? And they didn't want to get stuck in a similar kind of a lockdown, seeing an entire city of millions of people like this locked down. I had even posted 7 months ago when that happened. I said, if this is the new normal, if this is what's going to happen, something along the lines of this, that the COVID-0 is going to quickly lose support. It didn't take a genius to figure that out. You could see it coming from miles away. Now, the actual protests that happened. The protests that happened were sparked by the fires in Urumqi. When you actually look at the situation in Urumqi, it doesn't look like there's enough evidence to show that the fire happened or the deaths happened because of the COVID lockdowns. You can see that people under the fire and the floors under the fire got out, and that the fire trucks were blocked by parked cars on the road. There's a lot of issues with the way that people are presenting that story. And while I am grateful to people who are setting the record straight, I'm personally a little bit reluctant to focus on it too much, because then it looks like, or it risks looking like, you're trying to delegitimize the protests, which is based on real sentiment. It just required a spark. It required a catalyst. And it's kind of like in Iran too. In Iran, you had the protests that started under the premise that a young woman was killed in custody by police. But when police released the video showing that she collapsed on her own, it didn't matter to a lot of people, because to them there was another issue that they were really angry about that they wanted to voice. And even to today, CNN is saying things like the protests in Iran that were sparked by police killing a young woman in custody. Even though there's sufficient evidence to cast doubt on that claim, they don't care. That's an issue, but once again, kind of like the Urumqi fires, it acted as a catalyst. The other thing that risks looking like you're trying to detract from the real discontent over COVID-0 is when you talk about foreign interference, and there definitely is. It would be silly to not imagine that all of these people who were constantly hoping and wishing for the Chinese government to fail, even when the Harvard Ash Institute came out with studies showing that the Chinese government had over 90% support in China, according to their independent study, even then these people were hoping to see China crash and fall. So when finally sentiment really did reduce, because I don't think it would be a 90% approval rating during the last legs of COVID-0 here, you can be sure that they would try anything in their powers to kind of fan the flames here. And you saw it. You saw it in Telegram groups with foreign journalists arranging locations. You had one guy who was interviewed who was actually boasting about being and talking about the pressures about being the headquarters based in Europe for organizing protests in China. And it's remarkable when you really think about it, because if you had the same thing in reverse, where Russian or Chinese journalists or activists were behind the scenes and there was hard evidence of them instigating the George Floyd protests or getting people to protest in more cities, you wouldn't have heard the end of it until today. But whatever the case may be, that is valuable information for later to see how these kinds of color revolutions happen. But again, the risk of talking about it now is delegitimizing the actual legitimate issue. That is, people are not happy about COVID-0. That is real, and there's no taking away from that. And it's unfortunate that those journalists are doing those things, because it ends up creating a discussion about their interference when something more productive could be going on, when they could be talking about the real issues on the ground. So, after the protests, now this is where it gets really remarkable. Actually, before I get there, I want to mention that one thing I want to put some blame on the government here is that as the idea of the virus became more and more distant, not a lot of people really understood what was at stake, what the risks were. They didn't know about long COVID. And long COVID, I mean, there's studies coming out that it's really remarkable and very shocking about permanent damage, permanent changes to the brain, and things like that. And it may sound like something silly to worry about from somebody in the West listening to this, because living with this virus has been normalized. And it's understandable, because what else can you do? It's kind of like probably a way to mentally protect yourself too, because what is the use of worrying about it all the time if you can't do anything about it? But here they were doing something about it, but it was insufficiently understood. Why are we doing this? What is the plan? What exactly is the long-term goal? And all of these kinds of things. All of these kind of things. And I would put a little bit more responsibility on the Chinese government here for this, because when it comes to public ignorance, they have far more tools and far more systems in place to be able to effectively communicate their ideas to the people, more so than in the West. So I think that this was a failure on the part of the government to really help people understand what's at stake here. But anyways, what's the more interesting thing? To go back to the more interesting thing, is that shortly after these protests happened, within days, all of a sudden, there's a very sudden withdrawal from a lot of the COVID-0 policies. Barriers are coming down. COVID testing stations are being taken away. And it looks like there's going to be a very quick withdrawal from it. Or at least there's a lot of changes happening now. And what are my thoughts on that? I have kind of mixed feelings on that. Obviously, we want to get back to normal life. But at the same time, I kind of feel like the reaction to these protests may have resulted in a more hasty drawdown than would otherwise have been possible had the government communicated better and started their drawdown while they still had the patience and understanding of the people. Now, there are going to be consequences to draw down very quickly. I'm even seeing in Hebei already, a lot of the factories are allowed to go back to work, but many of them are not, because the majority of their staff have fevers. And when they try to call the hospital or go for medical attention, there's not much that can be done, because the medical staff are all infected also. This is one of the stories I heard of earlier. But inevitably, it's going to be a really tough challenge. Here in Chongqing, the low-risk areas were released first, and a lot of people were celebrating. But even the people who were most against the COVID-0 policies that I know, when all of a sudden the barriers came down from the more sketchy areas that still had some COVID risk, suddenly even they were saying, oh, hang on a second, we're going to have to be a little bit more careful. And these COVID-0 policies have affected businesses for so long because they had to constantly close down, especially restaurants and bars. But I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, because now people have an understanding that the responsibility for their own health is in their own hands. And it will create a reluctance for people to want to go out to restaurants and bars and things like that, at least during the initial phase when potentially the hospitals are going to be overloaded. Going back to the idea of having the luxury to have a slower, more controlled drawdown while they had the patience of the people, perhaps what they could have done is opened up city by city instead. And I'm not saying that in a selfish way, even if it was our city, because then they could see exactly what they're dealing with when they kind of let things go a little bit more. And also they would have the ability to allocate medical resources from other parts of the country to the various cities that are slowly being opened up, instead of just going for this mode where I think things are going to get overloaded pretty quickly. And what's going to be interesting is that all of the people who criticize COVID-0, you can be sure that most of them are also going to be criticizing the lack of care that a lot of people are going to be able to get as things start to rip through the country. As people start to die inevitably, or as hospitals kind of reach their limits, these people are going to be saying, look at China, look at them, look at how poorly this is being handled. Because for some people, there's absolutely no winning. They will always try to find a way to spin this into a negative. Now, I'm hoping that these years of lockdown created a period of time that allowed the Chinese government to prepare whatever it may be to increase the number of ICU beds, because that was one of the issues in the beginning too, was that China had a much lower number of ICU beds per capita compared to these other countries that also handled the pandemic very poorly. So there's a lot to be worried about. But the other idea of spinning things into a negative no matter what is quite interesting when it comes to examining what actually happened after these protests. Because a lot of these people, and I called it before, I said, you know what, because somebody said, oh, you know, I can't remember what they tagged me on, but I said, all of these people who have always said the people in China can't protest and the government doesn't listen to the demands of the people, you know, when and if the violent crackdown that they're anxiously awaiting doesn't happen, when and if the government actually starts responding by listening to their demands and relaxing the COVID-0 policies, none of these people will ever reflect on it for a moment. And sure enough, they aren't. They're finding a way to spin it into a negative. They're saying things like, oh, look, China is a paper tiger. They are scared of their people. It's like, good. I hope more governments around the world will be scared enough of their people to be accountable to them. And maybe in that case, protests like the George Floyd protests, which weren't hundreds of people across a dozen cities, but millions of people across hundreds of cities, would have actually resulted in major police reforms. Instead, it didn't. People are still being arrested today who participated in those. Occupy Wall Street that went on for, what was it, a year or something like that. Maybe that would have yielded serious results with reforms on Wall Street. It didn't. Nothing substantial was changed, and people were rounded up a year, 2 years after the protests for having participated in them as well. And it's a really hard thing for a lot of people to grasp, because you've got these pressure release valves in the West, these mechanisms where you can say, well, at least we can elect our leaders. If one messes up, we can vote them out and vote in a new one every 4 years or whatever it is in your particular country. And all of a sudden, even if the new person is not going to do anything substantially different than the last, you can at least blame the previous problems on the previous administration. And you're allowed to freely protest. You're allowed to criticize your government. You're allowed to do all these things. That's great. That's nice. But it creates a false sense of accomplishment when you can't actually step back and say, well, hold on a second. We protest this stuff for years and nothing changes. And China, this so-called dictatorship, within a few days has responded to its people. There's something really, really important to reflect on here. But that reflection isn't going to happen. And, you know, this isn't a one-off also. You know, in a lot of cases, I think it was Kishore Mahbubani who mentioned this too. In a lot of cases, the way that China is governed with they call it a meritocracy-based system, but it creates hyper accountability. It creates actually more accountability than in the West, because they don't have these pressure release valves. They don't have the ability to just say, okay, well, we'll vote for a new government. No, whatever happens, it was the responsibility of this government. And once again, it's not a one-off kind of a thing. I mean, there's a long history of protests in China actually yielding results. I think it was 2018 or 2019, not too far from where I was living in Guangdong province, there were protests that turned actually quite violent, opposing a crematorium that was being built in their town. What ended up happening in the end, the government came in, they gave the protesters amnesty, and they canceled the project. Again, actual results. Now, of course, the government doesn't encourage protests, and they try to have regular surveying. They have these systems in place where people can complain about the government, and they try to listen to the needs of the people without it resulting in protests. But when it gets to that level, you can see for yourself what happens. That should be, speaking of catalysts earlier, this should be the catalyst for people in the West who continually criticize China to examine their preconceptions about China. So I don't want to ramble on too much. There's so many other things I want to talk about on this topic that I haven't covered. And if you guys want to go into a little bit more detail, maybe I can have a discussion with one of my friends. I have a few different people that I was thinking of having a chat with about this topic that we could record in a format that is allows more ideas to be hashed out and more allows us to go through a few more ideas. But I just wanted to record a quick video, especially because a lot of my subscribers haven't seen me in a while, and it'll be good to see you guys after such a long time. And I'll try to fire the camera up and record something once in a while. So that is basically a very brief summary of what I think of the whole thing. It's a little bit messy because I think that once again, the government has some responsibility on its hands for the poor communication. But at the end of the day, it's a really tough situation to know exactly what to do. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this unfolds. There is a level of worry about the system being overloaded, but hopefully I'll stay in touch and I'll give you guys more updates soon. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace.